Vincent Marcelli ruled Chicago's underworld with an iron fist for 20 years. His name whispered in fear across the South Side. But when a girl in a stained apron walked into his private club and declared herself his boss, he laughed until tears streamed down his face. Emma Carson stood her ground, clutching a leather folder that would unravel everything he thought he knew about power, loyalty, and the empire built on his father's lies. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from. Vincent Marcelli sat in the back booth of the Ivory Rose, his private club on Halsted Street, watching the rain trace patterns down the floor-to-ceiling windows. Chicago's November chill seeped through the glass, but inside, crystal chandeliers cast warm light across mahogany tables and burgundy leather. The air smelled of aged whiskey and expensive cigars, a scent that had become as familiar to him as his own cologne. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered and impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit tailored on Savile Row. His dark hair showed threads of silver at the temples, and his face bore the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years of making impossible decisions. When Vincent Marcelli entered a room, conversations stopped. When he spoke, people listened. When he gave an order, it was carried out without question. Tonight, he was reviewing the weekly reports from his operations scattered across the South Side. Numbers flowed across the tablet screen, each digit representing a piece of his carefully constructed empire. Gambling, real estate, construction, waste management, all legitimate on paper, all feeding into the machinery that kept the Marcelli name powerful in a city where power was the only currency that mattered. "Boss, the Santini situation is handled." Marco, his right-hand man for 15 years, approached the booth. Marco was shorter, stockier, with a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, a reminder of a night 10 years ago when he'd taken a knife meant for Vincent. Vincent nodded without looking up. "Good. What about the property on Ashland? Closing next week." The owner finally saw reason. Everyone sees reason eventually. Vincent set down the tablet and lifted his glass of Macallan 25. The whiskey caught the light, amber and gold, a small luxury in an evening of routine business. He took a slow sip, savoring the smoky sweetness. This was his world. Controlled, predictable, secure. His phone buzzed. A text from his daughter, Sophia, away at Northwestern studying pre-law. "Dad, can we have dinner this weekend? I miss you." Vincent stared at the message, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest. Sophia was 21, brilliant, and determined to distance herself from the family business. She'd made that clear 3 years ago, when she'd refused to come home for Christmas unless he promised to go legitimate. He'd promised, lying smoothly, because losing his daughter wasn't an option. But going legitimate meant dismantling everything his father had built, everything Vincent had spent 2 decades expanding and protecting. He typed back, "Saturday, Giordano's, 7 p.m. The booth's leather creaked as he shifted, and he became aware of the small ache in his lower back, a reminder that he wasn't the young enforcer who'd climbed through the ranks anymore. He was the boss now, the king of a kingdom built on fear and respect, on connections that ran deep into City Hall and the police department, on the understanding that in Chicago, everyone had a price. Through the window, he watched a young woman hurry past, head down against the rain, a thin coat pulled tight around her shoulders. For a moment she paused beneath the club's awning, and Vincent caught a glimpse of her face, pale, tired, beautiful in the way that poverty sometimes sharpened features into something striking. She looked up at the club's neon sign, and for a strange instant, their eyes seemed to meet through the glass. Then she was gone, swallowed by the rain and the November darkness. "Boss, you want me to handle the Carson file personally?" Marco's voice pulled him back. "Carson?" Vincent frowned. "What Carson?" "The old man. Richard Carson. Used to run that accounting firm on Madison. He passed last month." Vincent searched his memory. Richard Carson. The name tugged at something, but he couldn't place it. "Why do we care? He was on the payroll back in your father's day. Did the books for the organization from 78 to 95. Then he went straight, moved to the North Side, opened a clean practice. Ancient history." Vincent dismissed it with a wave. "If he's dead, he's no threat. There's a daughter, Emma Carson, 25, works 3 jobs, lives in a studio in Pilsen. She's been asking questions at City Hall, pulling permits, digging through old property records." Vincent felt a flicker of interest. "Questions about what?" "Your father's holdings. The stuff from the early days before everything was cleaned up and put in trusts. The flicker became a spark of concern. Handle it. Quietly. I don't want problems. Marco nodded and left the booth. Vincent returned to his tablet, but his concentration was broken. His father, Dominic Marcelli, had built the organization from nothing, transforming a small crew of Southside muscle into a sophisticated operation that touched every corner of Chicago's underworld. When Dominic died 5 years ago, a heart attack in his sleep, peaceful and undeserved, Vincent had inherited not just the empire, but its secrets, its debts, its ghosts. He'd thought those ghosts were buried deep enough that they'd never surface. The club's music changed from jazz to something slower, a piano melody that reminded Vincent of his mother. She died when he was 12, cancer that ate through her like acid, and his father had thrown himself into the business with a fury that had terrified young Vincent. "This is what protects us," Dominic had said, gesturing at the clubs, the restaurants, the warehouses. "This is what keeps us safe. Power, Vincent. Never forget that power is the only shield that matters." Vincent had learned that lesson well. He'd protected his family, eliminated threats, made alliances, broken rivals. He'd done terrible things in the name of that protection, things that sometimes visited him in the dead hours of the night when even whiskey couldn't chase them away. But he'd kept Sophia safe. He'd kept the empire strong, and he'd kept the Marcelli name feared and respected. That had to count for something. The rain intensified, drumming against the windows like fingers seeking entrance. Vincent finished his whiskey and poured another. Outside, Chicago glittered and sprawled, a city of 8 million stories, most of them tragic, some of them redemptive, all of them tangled together in a web of choices and consequences. Vincent Marcelli believed he understood that web. He believed he controlled his corner of it. He had no idea that the young woman he'd seen beneath his awning was about to unravel every thread he'd so carefully woven, and that her truth would bring his kingdom of shadows crashing down around him. Emma Carson stood outside the Ivory Rose for a full 5 minutes, before her courage solidified enough to push through the heavy oak doors. The rain had soaked through her second-hand coat, and her sneakers squelched against the marble floor as she entered. Inside, the warmth hit her like a physical force, and for a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stand there dripping onto the pristine floor. A hostess in a black dress approached, her expression shifting from professional welcome to barely concealed disdain as she took in Emma's appearance. "I'm sorry, but we're a members-only establishment. I need to see Vincent Marcelli." Emma's voice came out stronger than she felt. She'd practiced this moment for 3 weeks, ever since the lawyer had handed her the folder and explained what it meant, what her father had done, what she was now entitled to claim. The hostess's laugh was musical and cruel. "Mr. Marcelli doesn't take walk-in appointments, honey. Especially not from—" She paused, her eyes scanning Emma's wet clothes, her scuffed shoes, her rain-plastered hair. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at a shelter. There's one on Roosevelt Road." Heat flooded Emma's cheeks, but she held her ground. 3 jobs, waitress at a diner in the morning, data entry in the afternoon, cleaning offices at night, had taught her how to endure humiliation. And the folder in her canvas bag represented something bigger than embarrassment, bigger than pride. It represented the truth about why her father had died with nothing, why she'd grown up in a 1-bedroom apartment with a mother who worked herself to exhaustion, why every childhood memory was tinged with the anxiety of not enough food, not enough heat, not enough money for school supplies or doctor visits, or the 1,000 small things that separated the poor from everyone else. "Tell Mr. Marcelli that Emma Carson is here to discuss her inheritance. He'll want to see me." The hostess's expression shifted to amusement. "Sure, sweetheart. I'll get right on that." She turned away, dismissing Emma entirely. But a man appeared from a hallway to the left, the same man Emma had seen in the surveillance photos she'd studied. Marco DeLuca, Vincent Marcelli's second-in-command, convicted twice in the 90s for racketeering, served 18 months, released on a technicality. He looked at Emma with the calculating gaze of someone who'd spent a lifetime assessing threats. "Carson?" His voice was surprisingly soft. "You're Richard Carson's kid?" Emma nodded, her heart hammering. This was it, the moment that would determine whether her father's final gift would mean salvation or nothing at all. Marco studied her for a long moment, then gestured toward the back. "Come with me." The hostess's mouth fell open. Emma followed Marco through the club, past tables filled with well-dressed men and women who looked at her with curiosity and contempt. She felt like a stray dog that had wandered into a palace, dirty and out of place. But she kept her chin up and her hand tight around her bag's strap. They reached the back booth, and Emma saw him. Vincent Marcelli was exactly as the photos had shown, commanding, handsome in a brutal way, with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail in an instant. He looked up from his tablet, his expression shifting from irritation to curiosity as Marco murmured something in his ear. Emma Carson. Vincent gestured to the seat across from him. Please, sit. Emma slid into the booth, her wet coat squelching against the leather. Up close, Vincent was even more intimidating. There was a contained violence in the way he held himself, a predator's stillness that suggested explosive movement could come at any moment. I apologize for your reception, Vincent said smoothly. My staff can be protective. You wanted to discuss an inheritance? Emma reached into her bag and pulled out the leather folder her father's lawyer had given her. Her hands shook slightly as she placed it on the table between them. My father, Richard Carson, was your father's accountant and business partner from 1978 to 1995. During that time, he was promised 40% ownership of 7 properties on the South Side as payment for services rendered and risks taken. Vincent's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. I'm not familiar with any such arrangement. The contracts are in here. Emma opened the folder, revealing pages of legal documents, notarized and witnessed. My father kept meticulous records. He was promised these holdings as insurance. If anything happened to him, if he was ever arrested or threatened because of his work with the organization, these assets would provide for his family. And let me guess, Vincent said, his tone amused. Your father never collected on this promise? He couldn't. Emma's voice hardened. In 1995, he was approached by federal investigators. Your father, Dominic Marcelli, told him to disappear, to cut all ties with the organization, to walk away with nothing. He was told that if he kept quiet, these properties would be held in trust for him. But if he ever spoke about the business, if he ever testified, his family would suffer. Vincent picked up one of the documents, scanning it with practiced eyes. Emma watched his face, looking for any sign that he recognized the truth of what she was saying. But his expression remained neutral, almost bored. This is a fascinating story, Vincent said finally. But even if these documents are genuine, and I'm not saying they are, they're nearly 30 years old. The statute of limitations on any such claim has long since expired. Not according to the trust language. Emma pulled out another document. The properties were placed in an irrevocable trust with my father as the beneficiary. The trust was designed to transfer automatically upon his death to his heirs. That's me. Vincent set down the document and leaned back, studying Emma with new interest. You've done your homework. I'm smart enough to recognize when I've been robbed. Emma met his gaze directly. My father spent his life keeping your family's secrets. He went to his grave protecting you. And what did he get for it? Nothing. He died in a charity hospital, drowning in medical debt, while you sit here drinking whiskey that costs more than my monthly rent. For a moment, Vincent's mask slipped, and Emma saw something she hadn't expected. Not anger, but a kind of weary recognition, as if she'd voiced a truth he'd been avoiding. Then he smiled, and the mask was back in place. You're asking for what exactly? 7 properties? Do you have any idea what those holdings are worth now? $18.4 million. Emma had memorized every detail. I checked the current property values. Vincent laughed then, a genuine sound that echoed through the booth. You walk in here, soaking wet, looking like you've been sleeping in a bus station, and you tell me you're owed $18 million. He laughed harder, and Marco joined in, and suddenly Emma was surrounded by the sound of men finding her claim hilarious. But she didn't flinch. She'd known this would be their reaction. She'd prepared for it. When Vincent's laughter finally subsided, she spoke quietly. I'm not asking for anything, Mr. Marcelli. I'm informing you that legally, those properties belong to me. I'm your boss now, whether you like it or not. The laughter died instantly. Vincent's expression turned dangerous, all traces of amusement gone. You want to be very careful about what you say next, Miss Carson. Or what? Emma's fear had transformed into something else, a reckless courage born from having nothing left to lose. You'll threaten me? Intimidate me? I've been threatened by poverty my entire life. I've been intimidated by every landlord, every bill collector, every person who looked at me the way your hostess just did. You don't scare me, Mr. Marcelli. You just make me angry. She stood, leaving the folder on the table. "My lawyer will be in touch. Those properties are mine, and I'm going to claim them. You have 2 weeks to prepare for the transfer of ownership." Emma turned and walked away, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Behind her, she heard Vincent say something sharp to Marco, heard chairs scraping, heard footsteps. But no one stopped her as she pushed through the club's doors and back out into the rain, where the cold November night felt like freedom, and the city lights blurred through her tears of terror and triumph. Vincent spent the next 3 days having Emma Carson investigated. What he learned disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. She was exactly what she appeared to be: poor, hardworking, and completely out of her depth. No criminal record, no suspicious connections, no hidden agenda beyond the documents her father had left her. Richard Carson had been a ghost in Vincent's memory, but Marco remembered him. Quiet guy, kept his head down, ran all the numbers for your old man back in the day. Smart as hell. He was the one who figured out how to hide the money trails, how to make everything look clean on paper. When the feds came sniffing in '95, your father had him disappear to protect the operation. They sat in Vincent's office above the club, surrounded by filing cabinets that held decades of carefully maintained records. Outside, the November sun struggled through gray clouds, casting weak light across the desk where Emma's folder lay open. "Did my father promise him properties?" Vincent asked. Marco hesitated. "I wasn't in the room for those conversations. But yeah, I remember there was talk about taking care of Carson, making sure he had something for his silence. Whether it was these specific properties?" He gestured at the documents. "I can't say for certain." Vincent picked up one of the contracts. His father's signature was there, bold and unmistakable. So was Richard Carson's. Smaller, more tentative. Witnesses included men Vincent recognized: Michael Torino, dead now, killed in a hit in 2003, James O'Brien, serving life in a federal prison, and someone named Patricia Wells, a name Vincent didn't recognize. "Find Patricia Wells," Vincent ordered. "I want to know if these documents are genuine, or if this girl is running some elaborate con." But even as he said it, Vincent knew the documents were real. He'd seen enough forgeries in his life to recognize authentic paperwork, and these contracts had the weight of truth. The question wasn't whether his father had made the promise. It was whether Vincent could find a way to make the problem disappear without fulfilling it. $18 million. The number sat in his mind like a stone. It wasn't that he couldn't afford it. The Marcelli organization was worth far more than that. But acknowledging Emma Carson's claim would open doors Vincent had spent years keeping sealed. It would mean admitting that his father had made promises that could now be legally enforced, that the empire wasn't as secure as Vincent claimed, that there were vulnerabilities in the foundation. And in his world, vulnerability meant death. His phone buzzed. "Sophia. Dad, still on for Saturday?" "Of course. Looking forward to it. Can we talk? Really talk? I need to ask you about some things." Vincent's chest tightened. "Anything, princess." The truth was, he and Sophia barely spoke anymore. Their relationship had become a careful dance of avoidance, with Vincent pretending his business was legitimate, and Sophia pretending to believe him. She was brilliant. She'd figured out the truth years ago, probably before she'd even been old enough to understand what it meant. And every year, she drifted further away, building her own life, creating distance between herself and the family name she'd been born into. Vincent had always told himself he'd done everything for family, to protect them, to give them opportunities he'd never had. But lately, he wondered if all he'd done was build a cage, golden and secure, that kept the people he loved trapped inside. Marco returned that evening with information on Patricia Wells. She's alive, 78, living in a retirement community in Naperville. "I spoke to her. She remembers the contracts, says she was your father's personal secretary from 92 to 98. She confirmed the documents are real, says she typed them herself on your father's orders." Vincent felt the walls closing in. "What else?" "She says your father felt guilty about Carson. Apparently, Carson took a lot of heat during the federal investigation. Lost his business, his reputation, nearly lost his family. Your father promised him those properties as compensation, told him it was untouchable money that would secure his family's future. And then my father died without ever transferring ownership. Looks that way." Vincent stood and walked to the window. Below, Halstead Street stretched away, neon signs reflecting off wet pavement. This was his kingdom. Blocks of businesses that paid tribute, operations that ran smoothly, a machine he'd perfected over 20 years. And now a girl with nothing threatened to expose the cracks in the foundation. "What are our options?" Vincent asked. Marco was quiet for a moment. Legally? She has a case. A strong one. Any judge who sees those documents and hears her story will likely rule in her favor. Illegally? Another pause. Boss, she's a civilian. An innocent. If something happens to her, especially now that she's made her claim public through a lawyer, it'll bring heat we don't need. The feds would love an excuse to tear into our operations. Vincent nodded slowly. Marco was right. The old ways of handling problems had become too dangerous in an era of surveillance cameras, digital trails, and federal task forces that waited for any excuse to launch investigations. The days of simply making inconvenient people disappear were over, or at least suspended until the risk became acceptable. So we pay her. $18 million is a lot of money to give away. It's a lot more expensive to go to war over it. Vincent turned from the window. But I'm not just handing it over. I want to meet with her again, privately. I want to understand what she's really after. You think there's more to this? Vincent thought about the girl who'd stood in his club, soaking wet and trembling but refusing to back down. There was something in her eyes that reminded him of himself at that age, a fierce determination born from having nothing to lose. She wasn't just after money. She was after something deeper, something that $18 million might not satisfy. Everyone wants something beyond the obvious, Vincent said. Find out where she works. Arrange a meeting somewhere neutral, somewhere she'll feel safe enough to talk honestly. Marco nodded and left. Vincent returned to his desk and picked up the folder again, studying the documents with new eyes. His father's signature stared back at him, a reminder that even the most careful men left messes for their sons to clean up. Dominic Marcelli had built an empire, yes, but he'd also built it on compromises and promises, on debts and obligations, on the bones of men like Richard Carson who'd sacrificed everything and received nothing. Vincent had always believed he was different from his father, more careful, more strategic, more aware of the long-term consequences of his choices. But looking at these documents, he realized he was simply carrying forward the same pattern, making the same mistakes, assuming he could control outcomes that were ultimately beyond anyone's control. His phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. Mr. Marcelli, this is Emma Carson. I don't want your money. I want a conversation. There's something about my father's death you need to know. Vincent stared at the message, feeling the ground shift beneath him once more. This wasn't about property or money or legal claims. This was about something else entirely. Something that reached back through decades and touched secrets Vincent hadn't even known existed. He typed back, tomorrow, Navy Pier, 2 p.m. Come alone. The response came immediately. I'll be there. Vincent set down his phone and poured himself a whiskey, the amber liquid catching the office's dim light. Outside, night had fallen completely, and Chicago transformed into a sprawl of lights and shadows, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Tomorrow he would learn what Emma Carson really wanted, and he suspected that whatever the truth was, it would cost him far more than $18 million to resolve. Emma arrived at Navy Pier 20 minutes early, her breath misting in the December air. The pier stretched out into Lake Michigan like a finger pointing at the horizon, and despite the cold, tourists wandered among the attractions, their laughter carrying across the wind. She'd chosen this location deliberately, public enough to be safe, open enough that she could see anyone approaching. She stood near the Ferris wheel, watching it rotate slowly against the gray sky, and thought about her father. Richard Carson had been a quiet man, gentle and sad, who'd worked long hours at jobs that never quite paid enough. Emma's mother had left when Emma was 8, unable to bear the poverty anymore, disappearing to California with vague promises to send for Emma that never materialized. It had been just Emma and her father after that, scraping by in their studio apartment, eating rice and beans most nights, watching television on a set with foil-wrapped antennas. Her father had never complained, never explained why they struggled when he'd once had his own accounting firm, when there'd been a brief period of Emma's early childhood, where they'd lived in a nice house in Oak Park, and she'd had her own room with wallpaper covered in butterflies. Then everything had changed. The house was sold, the firm closed, and they'd moved to the south side where the rent was cheap, and the neighbors were either too busy surviving to ask questions or too familiar with downward mobility to judge. He protected you, the lawyer had said, when he'd given Emma the folder 3 weeks after her father's funeral. Everything he did, every sacrifice he made, was to keep you safe from the life he'd been part of. Emma hadn't understood until she'd opened the folder and read the documents, the contracts, the letters her father had written but never sent. Then the truth had assembled itself like a puzzle. Her father had worked for criminals, had kept their secrets, had been paid for his silence not with money, but with promises. And when he'd tried to collect on those promises after his cancer diagnosis, when the medical bills had started drowning them both, he'd been told that the time for collection had passed, that he'd waited too long, that the documents meant nothing now. He'd died 3 days later, leaving Emma with nothing but the folder and a handwritten note. You deserve what was promised. Don't let them make you disappear like they made me disappear. Fight, Emma. Fight like I should have fought. She'd been fighting ever since, working with a legal aid lawyer who'd taken her case pro bono, gathering evidence, building a claim that would stand up in court. The meeting at the Ivory Rose had been her own decision, her own reckless attempt to confront the man who'd inherited her father's sacrifice. Miss Carson. Emma turned to find Vincent Marcelli standing a few feet away. He wore a long black coat and leather gloves, his face unreadable. Behind him, she spotted Marco DeLuca maintaining a discreet distance, and she realized that Vincent's promise of a loan had been as genuine as most promises from men like him. Thank you for coming, Emma said, though her mouth was dry. Vincent gestured toward a bench overlooking the water. They sat with 2 feet of space between them, 2 people from completely different worlds, united only by the sins of their fathers. You said there's something about your father's death I need to know, Vincent said without preamble. Emma pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. 2 weeks before he died, my father received a phone call. He was in the hospital by then, the cancer in his lungs and liver. I was sitting with him when his phone rang, and I watched his face change as he listened to whoever was on the other end. She handed Vincent the paper. It was a phone record, highlighting one number that had called her father's cell at 9:47 p.m. on October 15th. That number belongs to a burner phone purchased at a convenience store on Cicero Avenue, Emma said. The store's security footage shows a man buying it, the same man I've since identified as one of your enforcers, Tommy Calabresi. Vincent's expression didn't change, but Emma saw his jaw tighten. After that call, my father asked me to leave the room. He said he needed to rest. When I came back 20 minutes later, he was agitated, afraid. He kept saying, "They won't let me leave anything behind. They'll make sure you get nothing." And you think this phone call from someone in my organization contributed to his death? I think he was told that if I pursued any claim against the Marcelli family, something would happen to me. Emma's voice shook slightly. I think he died believing that fighting for what he was owed would put me in danger. And I think that stress, that fear, that final cruelty hastened his death. Vincent was silent for a long moment, staring out at the lake where waves rolled gray and restless toward the shore. A seagull cried overhead, a lonely sound in the winter air. If what you're saying is true, Vincent said finally, it was done without my knowledge or authorization. I don't threaten dying men or their daughters, but people in your organization do. Sometimes. Vincent's honesty surprised her. People in my world operate on certain assumptions about how problems are handled. Usually I know about it. Sometimes they act on their own initiative. And that's supposed to make me feel better? No. Vincent turned to look at her directly. Nothing about this situation should make you feel better, Miss Carson. Your father was used by mine, promised compensation that was never delivered, and then threatened when he tried to collect. That's the truth, ugly and indefensible. I'm sorry for what happened to him. I'm sorry for what happened to you. Emma felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. She hadn't come here for apologies. I want more than sorry. You want the properties. I want you to acknowledge that what was done to my father was wrong. I want you to make it right. Emma took a breath, and I want you to tell me why. Why did your father make those promises? Why did he keep my father on a leash for 17 years? What was so valuable about his silence? Vincent was quiet again, and Emma realized he was making a calculation. How much truth to reveal, how much to hold back. It was the calculation of a man who'd spent his life controlling information, doling it out in measured doses. My father's early operations were less sophisticated than what we run now, Vincent said carefully. There were activities that couldn't be easily legitimized, money that came from sources that couldn't be explained. Your father knew where the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively. If he'd talked to the feds, if he'd testified, half of Chicago's political and business elite would have gone to prison, including my father. So he was a liability. He was valuable precisely because he was a liability that chose loyalty. Vincent paused. My father respected that. The properties were meant to be insurance, A guarantee that if anything happened to your father, if he was arrested or killed, his family would be taken care of. It was supposed to be honor among criminals, such as that concept exists. But your father died before transferring ownership. Yes, and I inherited an empire with 1,000 moving parts, most of which I understood, some of which I didn't. Vincent's voice held a note of weariness. I didn't know about your father's claim. I didn't know about the promises. If I had... You would have done what? Honored them? Vincent met her gaze. Honestly, I don't know. 5 years ago, when I first took over, probably not. I was too focused on maintaining control, on showing strength, on making sure everyone knew that the Marcelli organization was still feared and respected. But now, he looked back at the water. Now I have a daughter who won't speak to me unless I promise to go legitimate. I have enemies circling, waiting for any sign of weakness. And I have moments, usually at 3 a.m, where I wonder what I've actually built with all this power and all this money. Emma studied him, surprised by the confession. This wasn't the man who'd laughed at her claim in his club. This was someone tired, possibly even regretful, though she didn't trust that impression enough to soften. I don't need your existential crisis, Mr. Marcelli. I need the properties that belong to me. I'll give them to you. Emma's breath caught. What? I'll transfer ownership of all 7 properties to you within 30 days. No lawyers, no court battles, no more delays. Vincent pulled an envelope from his coat pocket. This is a preliminary agreement drafted by my attorney. It acknowledges your claim, commits to the transfer, and includes a payment of $200,000 to cover your immediate expenses and legal fees. Emma took the envelope with shaking hands. Why? Why would you just give in? Because you're right. Because your father earned it. Because I'm tired of carrying my father's debts. Vincent stood, buttoning his coat against the wind. And because when I look at you, I see what my daughter might become if I keep making the same choices my father made. Someone who has to fight for basic dignity, who has to stand up to powerful men, who inherits nothing but struggle. He started to walk away, then paused. The phone call to your father. I'll find out who authorized it. If someone in my organization threatened him without cause, there will be consequences. Consequences. Emma's voice hardened. You mean violence. I mean accountability. In the only language my world understands. Vincent looked at her one more time, and Emma saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Not pity, but a kind of recognition, as if he saw her as an equal, rather than a problem to be managed. You fought like hell for what you're owed, Miss Carson. Your father would be proud. Then he was gone, Marco falling into step beside him as they walked back toward the pier's entrance. Emma sat alone on the bench, clutching the envelope, watching the Ferris wheel turn against the December sky. She'd come to this meeting expecting confrontation, possibly danger. Instead, she'd received surrender and apology from a man who ruled Chicago's underworld with an iron fist but couldn't control the ghosts of his own past. Emma opened the envelope and scanned the agreement. Everything Vincent had promised was there, in legal language that would hold up in any court. Her father's sacrifice, finally recognized. Her future, finally secure. But as she sat there in the cold, watching tourists laugh and children run, Emma didn't feel victorious. She felt the weight of what her father had carried, the burden of knowing too much, of being complicit in systems that destroyed as much as they built, of trying to protect the ones you loved while the world you'd made crumbled around you. Vincent Marcelli wasn't a monster. He was just a man trapped in the machine his father had built, trying to honor debts while maintaining an empire, trying to protect his daughter while running an organization built on violence. And Emma realized, with a clarity that made her chest ache, that in winning her fight, she'd become part of that same machine. The properties came with history, with blood, with connections to a world she didn't understand and didn't want to understand. But she'd take them anyway, because that was what her father had wanted, because $18 million meant freedom from poverty, from struggle, from the fear that had haunted every day of her life, even if that freedom came at a price she couldn't yet calculate. Vincent called a meeting of his inner circle the day after Navy Pier. 12 men gathered in the conference room above the Ivory Rose, captains who controlled different territories, operations, and revenue streams across the South Side. These were the men who'd helped Vincent build his empire, who'd profited from his leadership, and who now needed to understand the decision he'd made. We're transferring 7 properties to Emma Carson, Vincent announced without preamble. effective immediately. The room erupted. Questions, objections, demands for explanation, all voiced simultaneously in the aggressive posturing of men who'd spent their lives taking, never giving. Vincent let them talk for 30 seconds, then raised his hand. Silence fell immediately. These properties were promised to Richard Carson in 1995 by my father as payment for services rendered. The contracts are valid, witnessed, and enforceable. Miss Carson has every legal right to claim them. We can fight this in court and lose, bringing attention to operations we'd prefer to keep quiet, or we can honor the debt and maintain our reputation as an organization that keeps its word. Since when do we care about legal claims? This from Tony Ricci, who controlled the waste management operations and had never seen a problem he couldn't solve with intimidation. Since always, Vincent replied coldly. Our power comes from being predictable. People pay us because they know we deliver protection. They work with us because they know we honor our agreements. The moment we start breaking our own rules, we become indistinguishable from street thugs, and this organization falls apart. So we're just handing over $18 million to some girl because her dead father had old paperwork. We're honoring a debt my father created. Vincent's voice carried steel. Which brings me to the second issue. Someone in this organization called Richard Carson 2 weeks before he died and threatened him. I want to know who authorized that contact. The room went silent. Vincent let the silence stretch, watching faces, reading body language. These men were skilled liars, but Vincent had known them for decades. He could spot tells that would be invisible to outsiders. It was me, boss. Tommy Calabrese, an enforcer who'd been with the organization for 15 years, raised his hand. I heard through the grapevine that Carson's daughter was asking questions, pulling property records. I thought I was protecting us by warning the old man to keep his family quiet. Who told you to make that call? Tommy hesitated, his eyes flicking briefly to Paul Marcelli, Vincent's cousin, who controlled the gambling operations. It was barely a glance, gone in an instant, but Vincent caught it. I acted on my own initiative, Tommy said. Nobody authorized it. I just thought, you thought wrong. Vincent's voice was glacial. Richard Carson was dying of cancer in a hospital bed. He was a 70-year-old man who'd kept our secrets for 17 years. And you thought it was appropriate to threaten him with his daughter's safety? I was trying to protect the organization. You were trying to show initiative to impress someone. Vincent looked directly at Paul. Weren't you? Paul Marcelli was 2 years younger than Vincent, handsome in a softer way, with the kind of charm that had always made him popular at family gatherings. He'd risen through the organization not through violence, but through shrewd gambling operations that generated millions in clean revenue. Vincent had always trusted him, had brought him into the inner circle when he'd taken over, had treated him like the brother he'd never had. Vincent, I don't know what you're implying, Paul said smoothly. Tommy made a mistake. It happens. We discipline him and move on. The phone was bought with a credit card that traces back to one of your shell companies, Vincent said. I had it checked. So either you authorized the call, or someone in your operation did without your knowledge. Which is it? Paul's expression tightened. I may have mentioned to Tommy that the Carson situation needed handling. I didn't tell him to threaten a dying man. You didn't tell him not to. Vincent stood, placing his hands flat on the conference table. Let me be very clear about something. This organization exists because we maintain certain standards. We don't threaten civilians without cause. We don't target families. We don't act like animals just because we operate outside the law. Those rules kept my father out of prison for 40 years. They've kept me in power for the last 5. And anyone who breaks them, for any reason, is out. You're overreacting, Paul said. It was one phone call to protect our interests. It was one phone call that broke our most fundamental rule. Vincent's voice was quiet now, which made it more dangerous. And more than that, it was done behind my back, without my knowledge or approval. That's not protecting our interests, Paul. That's undermining my authority. The room watched, tense and silent, as the two cousins stared at each other across the table. This was more than a disagreement about tactics. This was a challenge to Vincent's leadership, a test of whether his word was truly law in the organization he'd inherited. I think you've gone soft, Paul said finally. This girl walks in with old paperwork, and suddenly you're handing over millions and lecturing us about rules. The Vincent I knew 5 years ago would have sent her away with nothing, and made sure she never came back. The Vincent you knew 5 years ago was making mistakes he's now trying to correct. Vincent straightened. Tommy, you're out. Collect what you're owed through this month. Then I don't want to see you again. Paul, you're removed from the inner circle. You'll continue running gambling operations, but you report to Marco now, and every decision you make gets reviewed. Paul laughed, a bitter sound. You're demoting me? Over this? I'm showing mercy. Vincent's eyes were cold. If my father were alive, Tommy would be at the bottom of the lake, and you'd be lucky to walk away with your kneecaps intact. I'm giving you both a chance to learn from your mistakes. Don't make me regret that decision. He left the conference room, not waiting to see the aftermath. Marco followed him to his office, closing the door behind them. That was risky, Marco said quietly. Paul has a lot of support in the organization. You just humiliated him in front of the captains. He humiliated himself when he went behind my back. Vincent poured a whiskey with shaking hands. The confrontation had taken more out of him than he wanted to admit. And if he has support, if people think his way of doing things is better than mine, then we have bigger problems than one demoted captain. What if he pushes back? What if he tries to challenge your leadership? Vincent drank the whiskey in one swallow. Then I'll handle it. But I'm not running this organization the way my father did, Marco. I'm not surrounding myself with yes-men who think brutality is the same as strength. I'm building something different. Are you? Because from where I'm standing, you're still running illegal operations, still profiting from gambling and extortion, still part of the same system you claim to be changing. The words hit Vincent like a punch. Marco rarely challenged him so directly. They stared at each other for a moment, and Vincent saw in his oldest friend's eyes a reflection of his own doubts. I know, Vincent said quietly. I know I'm a hypocrite. I talk about rules and standards while running an organization built on breaking the law. I preach about not threatening families while I've built my empire on fear. I'm trying to protect my daughter from the life I've chosen, while refusing to actually choose a different life. He set down his glass. But giving Emma Carson what she's owed, that's not hypocrisy. That's the first genuinely right thing I've done in years. Marco nodded slowly. Your father would have handled this differently. My father handled everything differently, and he died alone, with a son who respected him but didn't like him very much, leaving behind an empire and no real legacy beyond fear. Vincent looked out the window at the street below. I don't want that. I don't want Sophia to remember me as a man who had power but no principles, money but no honor. Then what do you want? Vincent thought about Emma Carson on that bench at Navy Pier, holding the envelope that represented her father's sacrifice. He thought about Sophia, brilliant and distant, building a life separate from everything he'd created. He thought about decades of choices that had brought him to this moment, standing in an office above a club that existed because his father had been willing to do terrible things in the name of family. I want to be someone worth remembering for more than the fear I inspired, Vincent said. I want to honor debts instead of creating them. And I want to believe that it's not too late to change the ending of this story. Marco was quiet for a moment, then clapped Vincent on the shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that meant more than words. Then let's make sure we survive long enough to write that ending. Vincent nodded, but as Marco left, he felt the weight of what he'd set in motion. By transferring the properties to Emma, by publicly disciplining Paul, by choosing principle over power, he'd created vulnerability in an organization that survived on projected strength. His phone buzzed. A text from Sophia. Dad, I'm proud of what you're doing. Emma Carson's lawyer contacted me. I've been advising her pro bono. I know this must be hard for you, honoring something that costs so much, but it's the right thing. Maybe there's hope for us after all. Vincent read the message 3 times, feeling something crack open in his chest. His daughter had been working with Emma Carson all along, helping her build the case, advising her on strategy. Sophia had been fighting him while also believing he'd ultimately do the right thing. She'd known him better than he'd known himself. He typed back, "See you Saturday. We have a lot to talk about." For the first time in years, Vincent felt the possibility of redemption. Not complete, not unearned, but real enough to reach for. The price would be high, the risks enormous, but some debts were worth paying, no matter the cost, even if those debts threatened to bring his entire kingdom crashing down. The property transfer happened on a cold morning in January, in a lawyer's office on Michigan Avenue, with views of the Chicago River. Emma signed papers with hands that trembled slightly, making official what had seemed impossible just 2 months earlier. 7 properties, collectively worth $18.4 million, passed from the Marcelli organization into her name. Vincent attended the signing, Marco at his side, watching as Emma's signature appeared again and again on documents that represented his father's broken promise, now finally fulfilled. When it was done, When the lawyers had gathered their papers, and Emma stood holding her own folder, this one containing deeds instead of contracts, she turned to Vincent. "Thank you," she said simply. "Don't thank me for giving you what was always yours." Vincent's voice was quiet. The weeks since their meeting at Navy Pier had aged him. Stress lines deeper around his eyes, gray, more prominent in his hair. What will you do now? Emma had thought about this question constantly. $18 million could buy comfort, security, freedom from the poverty that had defined her life. But it also came with responsibility, with the burden of knowing where the money had originated, what her father had done to earn it, what systems of violence and exploitation had generated the value she now claimed. "I'm going to sell most of the properties," she said, "but one, the building on Ashland, I'm going to convert into a community center. Free legal services, job training, resources for families trying to escape poverty. I'm naming it the Richard Carson Center, so at least one good thing comes from all of this." Vincent nodded slowly. "Your father would like that. Would yours?" "No. My father believed in taking care of your own, not wasting resources on strangers." Vincent smiled without humor. "But I'm discovering that I disagree with my father about a lot of things." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, two people bound by tragedy and transaction, with nothing left to say but aware that something had shifted between them. Not friendship, but a mutual recognition of the price of inheritance. "Mr. Marcelli," Emma said finally, "that thing you said about being tired of carrying your father's debts, are you actually going to do something about it?" "I'm trying." Vincent gestured toward the window, toward the city spreading out in all directions. "This organization, this life, it's all I've known since I was 22 years old. Walking away isn't simple. There are people who depend on the income, operations that can't just be shut down, consequences for leaving that extend beyond me personally." "Consequences like your cousin Paul?" Vincent's expression sharpened. "You've heard about that? My lawyer hears things. Your organization isn't as closed as you think." Emma hesitated, then added, "Be careful. People who feel humiliated don't just forget and move on. They wait for opportunities." "I know." Vincent's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it. "I have to go. But Miss Carson, Emma, I hope your center succeeds. I hope it helps people the way your father never got helped. And I hope you find some peace with all of this." He left with Marco, and Emma watched them go, feeling the weight of the folder in her hands. She'd won. She'd claimed what was owed, secured her future, honored her father's final wish. So why did victory feel so hollow? Her phone rang. Sophia Martelli's number. They'd become genuine friends over the past weeks, bonding over the strangeness of their connected circumstances. "It's done," Emma said. "I know. My father just texted me." Sophia's voice held complicated emotions. "Emma, thank you. What you did, forcing him to confront his father's debts, making him actually follow through on a promise. It's the first time in years I've seen him choose principle over power. I wasn't trying to change him. I was just trying to survive. Sometimes those are the same thing." Sophia paused. "Will I see you Saturday? Dad and I are having dinner, and he said I could bring you. I think he wants to keep proving he's not a monster." Emma smiled despite herself. "He's not a monster. He's just a man trying to carry weight that's too heavy for anyone to carry alone. Aren't we all?" After they hung up, Emma stood at the window watching the river flow beneath the bridge, dark and cold in the January morning. Somewhere in this city, people were waking up to poverty, to struggle, to the grinding anxiety of not enough that had defined Emma's entire life until today. Soon, she'd use her inheritance to help some of those people, to create the kind of support her father had never received, but she'd never forget where the money came from, or the compromises that had generated it. Freedom had a price, and sometimes that price was complicity in systems you couldn't change, but could only try to repair from within. 3 weeks later, Emma attended the grand opening of the Richard Carson Community Center. Sophia came, bringing Vincent, who stood quietly at the back of the crowd as Emma gave a speech about her father, about debt and dignity, about second chances, and the possibility of redemption. When it was over, Vincent approached her. "This is good work. It's a start." Emma gestured at the building, the legal aid office, the job training center, the child care facilities that would let parents work without worry. "My father kept your family's secrets to protect me. The least I can do is use what he earned to protect others." Vincent nodded, and Emma saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Tears, barely held back, present only for an instant before his mask returned. I'm proud to have known your father, even if I never actually met him. And I'm proud that his daughter is the kind of person who turns inheritance into legacy." He left then, disappearing into his car, while Marco held the door. Emma watched him go, this complicated man who ruled a kingdom of shadows but couldn't escape his own conscience, who'd honored his father's debt but couldn't yet escape his father's choices. Sophia stayed behind, helping Emma greet visitors, meeting the people who'd already found hope in the center's services. Later, as the sun set over Chicago and the winter cold deepened, they sat together in Emma's new office, modest but warm, with a photo of her father on the desk. "Do you think he'll actually change?" Emma asked. "Your father, I mean. Will he find a way out of the life he's built?" Sophia was quiet for a long moment. "I think he wants to. I think meeting you, being forced to confront what his family took from yours, showed him that power without principle is just another kind of poverty. But wanting change and achieving it are different things. What will you do if he can't change?" "Love him anyway. Maintain boundaries. Build my own life separate from his choices." Sophia smiled sadly. "We don't get to choose our fathers, Emma. We only get to choose whether we let their legacies define us, or whether we create our own." Emma looked at her father's photo, Richard Carson, smiling in a rare moment of joy before the weight of his choices had bent him into someone smaller, sadder, silenced. He'd made terrible compromises to protect her, had carried the burden of his choices until it killed him, had left her only the truth and the means to claim it. She couldn't undo his past, or erase the things he'd done, but she could honor his sacrifice by being someone he'd be proud of, by building something good from the fragments of his broken promises. "To complicated fathers," Emma said, raising her coffee cup. "To daughters who survive them," Sophia replied, touching her cup to Emma's. Outside, Chicago hummed and sprawled, a city of 8 million stories, some tragic, some redemptive, all tangled together in the web of choices and consequences that made up human existence. Vincent Marcelli drove through those streets toward his daughter's apartment, where they'd share dinner and talk honestly for the first time in years, beginning the long work of repairing what his choices had broken. Emma Carson sat in her office, surrounded by the evidence of her father's sacrifice and her own determination, building a legacy that honored debt while creating hope. And somewhere in the space between them, in the complicated intersection of power and principle, of inheritance and choice, of debt and dignity, a kind of redemption became possible, not complete, not unearned, but real enough to reach for. The crown of thorns that came with inheriting your father's choices would always hurt. But sometimes, if you were strong enough and brave enough and refused to accept that the past determined the future, you could transform that crown into something else. Not a kingdom, not power, not fear, just the simple, hard-won dignity of being someone who honored debts, kept promises, and believed that it was never too late to choose differently than your fathers chose, even if that choice cost everything you'd built to protect. Even if that choice meant admitting that the empire you'd inherited was built on bones. Even if that choice meant walking away from power to find something more valuable. The ability to look at yourself in the mirror and recognize the person looking back. Emma Carson had found that recognition in a community center named for a father who died with nothing but had left her everything that mattered. Vincent Marcelli was still searching for it, somewhere in the streets of Chicago, driving through the kingdom he'd inherited, trying to find the courage to lay down his crown. Whether he'd succeed, only time would tell. But for the first time in 20 years, he believed the effort was worth making. And sometimes, belief was enough to begin. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched your heart or made you think about legacy, redemption, and the choices that define us, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What part of the story resonated with you most? And don't forget to share where in the world you're listening from. Your support means everything, and it helps me bring you more stories like this one. Until next time, remember that it's never too late to choose differently.